welcome to Lunchtime Live with Colton and Brandon. We do this pretty much on a monthly basis. It looks like we have a few people here already in, and so thanks for joining. We appreciate that. So the last couple that we've done, we actually started with kind of stability QA, and then the next one we did was more code breakages and stuff like that. So we've got some content out there on YouTube, so go check that out. We can send some links out and stuff like that, so you know where to go to check out the older versions. But anyway, welcome. We're in sunny Salt Lake City, Utah. It's sunny now, but it's actually been snowing quite a bit since before the holidays. So we got a lot of snow on our beautiful mountains. If you've ever been here. Anyway, so this time we're going to do basically helping you hit your software development timelines. And so we'll just go through and kind of hit some key points. Anybody along the way, if you have any questions or even comments, you can write them up there, or you could come live. Just raise your hand and we'd be happy to listen to some of your comments or questions. But don't be afraid. We'll get started and we'll have Colton kind of kick us off with some of the key points.
All righty, awesome. Thanks, Brandon.
Yeah.
So yeah, as Brandon said, what we'll be doing is just kind of going through some of the key points that usually cause software teams to miss their timelines and what you can do to address those. And again, anybody that's on the webinar, feel free to raise your hand or shoot a message through chat, and we'll make sure to address those at any time. So yeah, so obviously, like, the big question here is, what's the most common reasons timelines are missed? So there's many little things that will deter you from hitting that timeline. Kind of the best way to think about it is kind of from the beginning of the project, at the beginning of the phase, kind of through till the end. So first thing that comes up would be a lack of clear requirements or goals. So obviously it's hard to hit a timeline and reach a goal when that goal is unclear. So that's something that's really going to be handled initially from the executive team or the product team. They need to be able to clearly define what those requirements and goals are to the development team. And obviously that's an exchange and back and forth between the product team, the development team, and the executive team. The software team needs to kind of help instruct and work with the product team or the stakeholders to make sure that they are getting the clear requirements needed to properly create a timeline. So we'll see this sometimes where we'll talk to maybe stakeholders with the company of a product that we're looking to build, and they'll explain something very high level, very brief, maybe even vague, and they know exactly what they want in their head, but maybe they're not explaining it very well. So again, it's up to our project management team on our side. This is something that we do really well. We've got a lot of practice in and kind of guiding them and pulling that information from them that we need to create that clear timeline or clear requirements. So that way we can develop a timeline. Kind of right from there, the next step is a lack of proper planning. That's another big cause of missing those timelines. So let's say, we get those requirements, we've got clear goals, but we take that to our planning and we don't do proper planning, right? We don't establish what everything that needs to be done that goes into building this out. So, let's say we want to build in some sort of integration with, let's say, calendars, right? We say, hey, we want to integrate with Google. If we just say, let's integrate with Google, let's just throw that into the development schedule and let's just say that's going to take a week or 2 weeks. And then that's it. That's the plan. We move forward. That's going to prevent us, it's going to create a lot of issues going down the line, because maybe Google's had some updates with their integrations. Maybe there's a lot of new things that you have to be handled or taken care of to do these integrations. So without actually going through and reading the documentation, making sure we're up to date with everything that has to do with that integration, we really can't properly estimate a timeline or understand all the complexities of doing that integration. So if we don't actually do the proper planning, those timelines and identifying the complexities aren't going to be done right, and that's going to throw our timeline off.
Yeah. So I would like to make one clarification. So kind of my role versus Colton's, and I think we've talked about this in the past, but just to make sure everybody understands, Colton obviously is more on the technology side, and I'm more on the sales side. we get a lot of clients coming in every single month. And basically, we separate them into two kind of buckets. We have startup companies and then companies that we deal with more of a staff augmentation type scenario. And so when we start to look at both buckets or both types of companies, every single one of them still has the same requirements, right? So if we have a startup company and someone comes in and they just have a concept on a napkin, that's fine. What we really want to point out is that our team can help in a lot of different ways. Maybe not as much on the business side, although we do push back on certain concepts. If people come to us and they're kind of headed down the wrong direction, we can kind of redirect in that way. But also, when you're just working on a project and it's more staff augmentation, you just need more bodies to help out with that project. Our team can really help to identify some of these, some of the direction and then some of the goals as well. I think we've all probably heard of, I guess, some of the ways to the SMART goals. It's SMART as an acronym. So it's specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. And so actually coming into ZipTech, you get a little bit of both worlds. So the business type as well as kind of that technology direction. So that's important to know.
Definitely. Yeah, it's always kind of important to understand the dynamics and everything. But yeah, I guess, kind of going from my last point, talking about that lack of proper planning, I lightly, touched on unforeseen complications. That's kind of my next point. Without really deep diving into whether it's, building a feature, doing an integration, designing something, really like anything that has to do with software development, without really doing proper planning, you're going to run into unforeseen complications. And then even at the end of the day, even if you do great planning, there's always going to be something that pops up at some point that you weren't prepared for. So that's a big one that can throw things off. Again, if it's more of a complex issue, that's something that, right, maybe we think it's going to be a week's worth of work. We get halfway through it and then we find out, oh, this is a lot bigger than we had originally expected it to be, right, or intended it to be. And that can turn maybe a 1 week estimation into 2, 3, 4 weeks of work instead. One of the things I will point out with that, though, is that's where the Agile process comes in, is really helpful, because if you plan out a year's worth of work, you try to do that all at the beginning of the year, you try to break it all down waterfall style, and then you run into one of these unforeseen complications. Well, that can throw off a whole year's worth of planning and work, because maybe that 1 week turned into 5 or 6 weeks even, and now your whole 1 year plan is all thrown off. So that's why these 2 week sprints that we work in really fall in the Agile process. Makes it flexible to where you can handle these items as they come up and make plans, right? Okay, let's see, that 1 week is going to turn into 6 weeks. Well, let's plan this one sprint, and then we can break that work out into other sprints, and we can manage that a lot better. The next thing I would say, still kind of in the planning phase, is insufficient resources. So a lot of people fall into the trap of, whether it's you're working with a company like ourselves where you're hiring a development company to build a product for you, or you've got your own in-house development team. Sometimes you have the limitations of either budget, or maybe you've got a set team that already works for your company, and you have goals that you want to do that's either tied to your company, or maybe there's something up and timelines you need to meet, and you try to just meet that within the constraints of your time, of your budget, or your current team. And sometimes it's just get it done. That's kind of the way that it's presented by stakeholders is, if you come to us and you say, hey, I want to hit a timeline within 6 months, here's the requirements. We tell you need a team of, let's say 6 developers. Sometimes we will have clients that will say, well, I can only afford 4 developers for 6 months. And then that falls into, let's just try to get it done. Let's just get it done with what we have and just make it work somehow. Right. And we can't necessarily magically make those things happen. And same thing with an in-house team, right? Maybe they only have 4 developers on staff, but really they need 6 developers to hit that timeline, or they just don't even have the specific skill sets within their current team to accomplish their goal, right? So there's ways, obviously, that the easy solution to that is grow the team, hire the people you need. But then there's also kind of goes back into planning of, well, if you've got a plan that, within 6 months you need that, 6 developers, well, maybe there's a trimmed down version of that really does still achieve your goal. It just maybe removes some of those bells and whistles that you can still achieve with the resources that you either can afford or have on hand.
That's something that we've actually run into quite often is, let's say it's a company that, whether it's a startup or if it's an existing company that's already making revenue, a lot of companies or people will come in with the expectation that the project is going to be perfect. The process along the way is going to be seamless. And what we've found is that's rarely the case. And I think anybody that's been on projects like this would attest to that. And so we really try to give the expectation up front that, yeah, we have a process and we follow that very closely. But oftentimes, what the expectation would be is you really need to have the budget and even add more onto that budget with an expectation that could go over, because what we're doing is creating a project, or maybe it's an app or a web app or something like that that's really never been created before. And there's no instruction, there's no pattern for that. There's no blueprint for that exactly. There's a process that will get us to that point, but having a proper expectation of, how is this project going to go? And ultimately, I'm responsible for the outcome of that, because I've chosen to do that. Number one, I've chosen to be an entrepreneur, or I've chosen in my company to build custom software. And so the expectation should be, yeah, we're not going to get an exact estimate, whether it's monetary or time or whatever. Expect that this is going to take a little bit of doing. And part of that, what we're trying to do is actually eliminate some of the risk that's involved in that. So we can, on our end, with lean principles, or maybe you're not into lean, you're into something else methodology wise, but also with Colton and doing the agile development, we are actually going to break this down into smaller pieces, and that's going to offer you more, less risk.
Points. Awesome. All righty. So then, on to the next point. This kind of gets more into, obviously this starts from the beginning portion, but this leads more into once the project gets started. A big issue with, not meeting your timelines is inadequate communication. Again, either during the planning phase or during development. So let's say during the planning, you've got all your plans lined out, everything looks great. Maybe you've even communicated great at that point. But then as the project goes on, maybe things come up, right? Things change, the market changes, the requirements change. Maybe even some of these third-party tools or systems you want to integrate with are changing or deprecated or something like that. If the development team kind of works in a bubble and they just address these issues without communicating back to the stakeholders, by the time you either get to your timeline, your deadline, or close to your deadline, is when the stakeholder finds that out and realizes, the development team's kind of gone down the wrong direction. Well, now we ran out of time to address it. And so a big part of agile development is continuous communication and looping in everyone that needs to be done, that needs to be part of it, right? And that doesn't mean having stakeholders on every single stand-up and having daily communication, but having a proper schedule where you're meeting with your development team, maybe just the project manager and the development teams are meeting every day, and then you loop in a stakeholder at the end of every sprint, or maybe even every month. Just making sure you have that continuous open communication to properly discuss what's been done, what's going to be done in the short term, and then reevaluate that timeline, what those goals and expectations are. And that's another big one. If you're working on like a 6-month project, if you get about 3-4 months into that project, people will remember what was discussed, 3-4 months ago, but that might all be different, right? If I have a conversation with Brandon 3 months ago, and then we both try to recall what happened, I'm sure our recollection of that conversation will be slightly different, right?
No, I'm not going to remember.
yeah, exactly. Brandon probably won't remember we had the conversation, but so that's it's important to continue to touch base on those things, so that way when you're talking about it, it's a conversation you had a week ago, not something we talked about 3 months ago. So that's a huge part of agile development. You really can't work in agile without following that process.
I would actually like to throw in there just kind of a benefit. It's a little bit off topic, but with ZibTech, the way that we work is we have project managers on both sides of a project. So a project manager that works with the client, so interfacing with either the project manager on their side, or it could be the owner of a business or whoever that might be. They also interface with the project manager on our Bangalore side, which is where our dev team is. So you get the benefit of having kind of a liaison on both sides of the aisles, which is super helpful for a project.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we break it out to where we have somebody more focused on working with the team to get the tickets and everything managed, and then we have a whole resource dedicated here in the US that's main concern and main focus is making sure that communication is going well. So we found that works really well.
Yep.
All righty. So next point I got here is goes right again with communication and planning. As you can kind of see it all kind of works together, but you can see it kind of go down the line throughout the process. But a big one that we see with pretty much every project, probably in my mind, one of the biggest things that messes up timelines is change requests. And that's, again, markets change, requirements change. If what you planned at the beginning of the year, halfway through the year, your business might be completely different, and your clients could be different, your needs could be different. And with that comes change requests, right? Maybe there's whole features you don't need anymore. Maybe there's budgetary constraints. Maybe there's, a new audience you want to pander to. There's so many things that can happen during the development schedule that needs to be addressed, right? And so change requests are okay, and they can be done. And that's a good thing, again, with Agile, is Agile allows you to do change requests and make those adjustments as you go. But if they're not handled correctly, what happens is, obviously that's going to affect your timeline, because the timeline that was given up front didn't include that change request, right? Didn't include this new feature or a change to a feature. So those, if handled correctly, can be fine. But ultimately, right, if you want to add something into the requirements that wasn't there at the beginning, either additional resources need to be added or something needs to come out of that original plan. The issue is a lot of the time, again, like stakeholders, business owners, they want to add things and change things, but they also don't want to lose things. So that's a big thing for the development team or project manager to really push back, on their stakeholders and make sure that they're clear on, something needs to come out if you want to put something in, and then clearly define how that's going to change your timeline. That's a big one, in occurrences where we've been able to handle that correctly, or I've worked with other teams that handle that correctly. Everything's gone smooth. But in a lot of the projects I've seen over the years, or worked with other companies over the years, that's been kind of the biggest issue with meeting timelines is change requests. Next one, again, this is all more during the process or even coming towards the end of the process, is a lack of testing and quality assurance. So what a lot of people want to do, and kind of the easy way to do it, is you build out the whole product, and then once everything's built, you go give it to users and test it. And then what happens is there's just a slew of issues, right? You get all these different people that get their hands on it. They look at it from different perspectives, use it differently, use it on different pieces of hardware, use it with different, internet capabilities. There's a million variables that come into play, and then you find a million problems, and maybe it's only a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks before your timeline, and there's no way you can address them all. So what we make sure we do is we make sure we have quality assurance engineers either doing manual testing or automation testing from the very beginning of the project all the way through to the end. And that way we'll continuously find small bugs and small issues that we just address during our sprints. And that way it's a small fix. We're already in that code. We're already in that feature. We just make that small adjustment before we move on to the next feature. And then even if bugs do come up, we can communicate. Maybe we're 1 day behind or 3 days behind, well before the end of the goal, right? So that either that gives us some time to make that time up over the course of the next couple months, or we can even let stakeholders know, hey, by the way, we're, because of these bugs or these issues, we're X amount of days behind, and that gives them time to plan and make sure they will have the budget for those extra few days or weeks, or if we may need to make adjustments to other features. A big thing that's in the that's keeps getting more and more popular within software development is the shift left method, basically that's saying you just do small pieces and you take care of those before you kind of move on to the next piece. So you have QA involved kind of at the beginning of the project, and they're working with the development team to understand product and the requirements, and then test it while we're in the middle of development. Not development team pushes it, they move on to the next task, and then QA picks it up and then finds these issues. Having QA on a project, it's something a lot of people don't want to pay for because those people aren't actively building new features, but it's 100% necessary in order to hit your timelines.
Yeah, let me actually zoom out kind of a 20,000 foot view. So there's a guy named Bill Gross. He does founder Idea Lab. He says there's 5 key factors influencing startups. That's the idea, the team, the business model, the funding, and the timing. Some of those you can control, some of you can't control. The whole idea of that is to prove the business model, right? Whether you're in a startup or if you think of a business, maybe a corporation, but within that you have kind of micro startups or ideas, products, projects, anything like that. So the whole idea is to take each one of those and test them out. And so if you're trudging forward and you've got these change requests and you expect that the whole thing, like that's what I was talking about with expectations, is you expect that we've kind of figured out what it could possibly take or the timeline or the cost, but you have these change orders. Obviously, that's going to be problematic. That's going to create a lot of change. But what happens if you have that in your mind and something's not really working or functioning as you thought it would in the business, and you have to make a major pivot? So you have to expect that some of those things are going to change. You've got to expect that there are going to be alterations and pivots in your company. That's the whole point of creating what you're creating in small bits. But ultimately, if you're not testing and you're not putting those things properly in place, even on the business side, you can't really get to the proper testing and QA on the dev side. So.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and as Brandon pointed out, kind of keeping that idea of a goal, right, is what do we need, right? Maybe it's a product or it's a feature, set of features. And from there, we bake that into a million little features or things within the app or software, right? But sometimes we get so caught up in these individual small features, we lose sight of what the overall goal is, right? So let's just say, I want to build a software that allows my users to, sign up for appointments for my business. Maybe I'm a hair salon and I want to, allow them to sign up for appointments. From there, right, we break that down into a bunch of features and UI and design and how it's all going to work. And then we find ourselves working on all these cool features in that and bells and whistles that are good and good to have. But the issue is then we get into the project and maybe we're looking at the timeline and we end up focusing so much on some of these features that we don't really need that kind of tie into the overall goal but aren't necessary for the overall goal. And they keep us away from focusing on completing the original goal, right? And so that kind of goes with one of my last points here is not prioritizing properly. So what we'll see a lot too, again, with stakeholders or clients or just anyone, even within your own company, that's involved in the project, if they're not on the development team, what we find is most people are visual, right? Like they usually don't care too much on what's going on in the database or the back end. They don't see it, so they don't really care. So what they focus on is the front end of things, is how does it look? And so what you can really fall into a trap with is you can spend several days or weeks revising and making sure everything's pixel perfect, all the colors are beautiful, all the drop downs work and look exactly right. And you can turn maybe what was 1 week of work into 2 or 3 weeks of work, making it look beautiful. But now you've gotten to the end of your timeline and you've got 3/4 of a product completed. So you've got 75% of this product completed. It looks amazing and beautiful, but it technically doesn't do anything because it's not complete. And so the most important thing is to prioritize what are those core functions and tasks, getting those done. And then from there, you can kind of focus in on revisions and making it look making it look better, or covering edge cases. That also goes into not spending time, right? You want to cover edge cases with QA and make sure, this thing's not going to break for people, but you also have to work as a team and communicate, make sure edge cases that are being covered are actually something people are gonna do, right? So if you find some crazy edge case that you think only one user will ever run into, that's something we want to address, but maybe put that on the back burner, until we make sure those core functions are taken care of. So something we always push for is focusing on the function and the goal of the product, making sure that gets done first and foremost within the timeline. That way our clients, or again, if an internal team, their team and their company has a product, has a software that does what it needs to do, and then they can go back again, focus on making it look beautiful, making it look pretty, adding on some bells and whistles that maybe aren't necessary but are cool to have. But yeah, so that's one of the biggest ones that's kind of during and towards the end of a software development phase or product development phase, and that's really important to cover. Really, my last point that I've already kind of addressed on some other points is dependencies. This is a big one that's, again, helps with planning, helps with ongoing planning and communication, is dependencies of third parties or external factors, right? So obviously, like something like COVID could really affect a team, or maybe there's a third-party tool or software that you want to integrate with or have integrated with, it becomes deprecated. Now you got to figure out how you're going to change that. That's going to throw, definitely a wrench in your gears and throw a big curveball for your team. So that's another one. Again, not something you can always control, but it's something that if you continue to plan, you continue to communicate with your team, it's something that can be addressed and not throw off your whole timeline. But again, if kind of left, if you integrate with something and then just ignore it and move on and don't stay up to date on its updates and its requirements, it's something that can come and bite you in the rear down the road. But yeah, that's pretty much all the points I have.
That kind of wraps up. We're kind of at the end of the time, and we appreciate all that information. It's awesome information. Colton's outstanding. He's done probably more than 200 projects since he's been here. So that's a lot of great information about that. I didn't check questions or if we had any other comments, trying to juggle that along the way. But if we do, maybe that's something we could address in the last couple of minutes.
Yeah. It looks like we got a few more minutes before we got to jump. But let's see here. I've got one question. How do you solve issues with a team missing skill sets? Should you lean on training or hiring for that particular skill? So that's a great question, and it's definitely case by case, right? Maybe there is a skill set that's very similar to something that you've already got team members that they already possess, and maybe that's a great opportunity for somebody on your team to learn a new skill. So maybe you can set time aside during your development cycle for them to become aware of, and learn and train up on that skill, right? You could set time aside for them to pick those skills up, and then you can roll that into your development team, and they can actually be assigned tasks where they have to use that skill. That's something that's really, really helpful within a team that has a budgetary restraint, or ultimately they just don't want to hire, more people. But in some cases, especially maybe it's a small one-time thing you need done. And sometimes the scenario, it's best to just bring someone in for a short period of time, get that thing handled, taken care of, and then that way they can jump back out of your team. That's something that we've done a lot in the past with clients. They maybe even have a development team. They're missing just a specific skill set where they just need it for maybe 1, 2, 3 months. We can come in, we can leverage one of our resources, we can get it done and then jump back out. That saves them from having to hire someone, or take 3 months to train someone on something for only 3 months worth of work. I think we'll try to squeeze one more in here. When a company is pioneering a project and the scope of the project is susceptible to changing, which may lead to deadlines being pushed back, what would generally be the best approach for them in these cases to help? So that's a great question. I mean, it's definitely a tricky one, right? If you're pioneering something that's new, right, something that no one else has been done before, it's really hard to identify all of those hurdles or things you can fall into or issues you're going to have. So I mean that kind of comes with the scenario of if you're being a pioneer, you don't know what lays ahead. So that is tricky. But again, I would say planning and then ongoing communication. Again, I'll keep hitting on that because those are key to Agile, is having a smart team. You try to plan as much as you can, but then being prepared for when something blows up in your face or something doesn't work out. Be ready and be flexible to just make a change. Let's figure out what an alternate solution is and move forward. Right? Like if you look at like the military, for example, if you look at those like special forces guys, they do all the great planning, but those guys are very, very smart and ready. If something goes wrong, maybe one of their guys gets hurt or something, they don't freak out and panic because their plan didn't work perfectly. They figure out how to adapt and just move forward. So I would say that's a big one.
And using that analogy, like you could also depend on other people. Maybe you have mentors in your company or people that you could depend on for other information that you don't have. There's other use cases out there, companies that have succeeded and they've done something, maybe it's an analogous type industry or something that would seem similar. You can maybe go to them and ask for assistance, or maybe just look at their model and see how they've done things. But ultimately, you can set up a little test to verify some of this stuff along the way. And I think if you verify, like we said, the smaller things, ultimately, I think the big picture will come into view.
Definitely. And I think that was pretty much all the questions we had. So thank you everybody for joining. It was great chatting with y'all. We'll be posting this on YouTube, so everyone can watch it again later if need be.
It's Lunchtime Live with Colton and Brandon.
Yes,
I don't see any lunch here though.
Next time.
Hopefully you guys have some.
All right, have a good one.
All right, take care, guys.